Hey, what's going on everyone? Today we have the meta snapshot for patch 14.9b. There was like a very tiny B patch. They didn't really change too much. They fixed a big bug, which obviously is really helpful. That was the main reason why they did it. And then they did a small nerf to Lissandra and a pretty decent nerf to Talisman of Ascension, which was one of the new artifact items that we talked about earlier. And it was just by far the most important one. So we're going to go over how to play every single comp. We're going to go over what items we put on which champions, and what augments to go for, but let's go over the summary first. Right now, it's going to be one of those like fast 8, fast 9 metas, where if you're high rolling, you go for fast 9. If not, you go for either the Kaisa comp or the Ashe comp, and then worst case scenario, you go for something else. If everything's contested or you don't get items for one of the top 3 comps, then you could go for something else, or if you get very specific augments, such as like Ethereal Blade Shen, amazing in my opinion. The Umbral Alune build, pretty solid. Syndra Faded, if you get a Faded emblem, it's a really powerful build to go for. Same for a bunch of the other trait augments. As usual, I always recommend data checking certain trait augments. Head on over to teamfight.lol, go to stats, and then go to augments or traits. Sometimes you want to go to augments, type in whatever trait augment you have here, so we could look up like Inkshadow for example, and we could see in the previous patch it did pretty badly, but that's because Inkshadow is used with Ghostly a bunch. I expect this to do a little bit better in the future. We could also type in something like Crest or Crown to see what the best ones are right now, and pretty much anything that has higher average placement than like a 4.4, you could do pretty decently with them. Not saying the other ones are unclickable, there definitely is a time and place for everything, but it really just depends on what your board is by the time you get the augment. Another thing to note is that crowns got buffed a ton. Some of them give like so many units now, even some of the bad ones. For example, Behemoth Crown, I know it's 4.7, but you gain a Yorick and a Thresh, an emblem, and an item. This is much more than what you got in the past. I have a small feeling that people are kind of misplaying some of these emblems right now, because a lot of them got buffed where you get like just a ton of value. But going back into the meta snapshot, you want to be playing these weird comps if you get very specific augments. If not, default to Ashe and Kaisa if you're playing a normal game, and then go for fast 9 and 5 costs if you're kind of high rolling that game or doing really well. I expect Shen and Senna reroll to do a lot better in 14.9b compared to 14.9 because they're fixing Ghostly, and Ghostly was just flat out bugged before. Kayn Lee Sin, okay, but the other comps are better. Lux Reroll, this is one of my favorite comps of the set. It's decent right now, you kind of need a good spot for it, not like hard forceable by any means. Aphelios Reroll, you definitely want +1 Faded for that. Yone, if you get a ton of them, sure. Janna, Zyra Reroll, this is if you get very specific augments. And then we kind of talked about some of the other ones down here, or they are purely augment checks. So starting off at the top, we have fast 9ing and 5 costs. So whenever you're on an encounter that gives a ton of gold, you get an augment that gives a ton of gold, such as like Level Up or Hedge Fund, things like that. This is when you want to consider going for this comp. Maybe you get the Tristana encounter, which gives a ton of gold, or maybe you're on Triple Prismatic, for example. You want to build flexible items so that you have random things you could put on whatever legendaries you 2-star and then go for those units. So it could be Aurelia if you have a bunch of AD items, or Wukong if you have a bunch of healing items, or like a blue buff. Azir works well with any attack speed or mana item and AP item. Hui is really good with Morello plus other stuff. Random tank items in your front line. Ornn's a solid tank, splashing in Dragon Lord's really good. You could even do like 4 Dragon Lord. 4 Dragon Lord is extremely powerful all the time. Udyr, Rakan can be other tanks too. And pretty much anything goes. You can play the other legendaries as well. It doesn't have to be the ones you see here. But pretty simple comp. You want to, again, only play this if you're playing regular and then you're like purely win streaking, or you have like a ton of gold, maybe it's on Scuttle Puddle, and then get to level 9 really quickly, roll down like at least 30 gold. I prefer having like 40 or even 50 if my health can afford it, but it's extremely powerful right now. Next comp up we have is Trick Shot Bruisers. We have the budget comp up here if you are in a low roll game where you have a lot of cheaper units such as Riven, Aatrox, Teemo, and Sivir. And then we have like the Bill Gates comp down here, Jeff Bezos comp. You know, they're not even the richest people anymore. It's the person who owns Louis Vuitton. I forgot his name. I think it's like Arnault or something like that. But you can play the more expensive version down here, which is going to revolve around Xayah and Dragon Lords. So as you can see here, a bunch more expensive units. We don't have any 1 costs. We have only 1 2 costs, which is just Janna. So we bumped them up to 3 costs. We have 1 more 5 costs. It's pretty expensive considering like the 2 stars are more important. I've seen team comps get away with only having a Galio 1, but when you play this build, you really need the Ornn 2 because it's your main tank. All the other frontline units, they don't really tank that much. Like Lee Sin, not really. Diana, 2-star without items, not really. Volibear, not really. Udyr, I guess kind of, but not really too, because he has a D aggro. So you really need the Ornn 2-star, very critical for this comp to fully work out. But items on Kaisa, kind of the same. You just want to get Trick Shot in, put generic AD or attack speed items on her. Maybe you get one of the Inkshadow items that work really decently, but the comp kind of plays itself. And both these versions work perfectly fine. Just depends on whether you have a ton of gold or whether you have a bit less gold. By the way, more info can be found on every single comp by heading on over to the website bunnymuffins.lol/meta, where we update this tier list every single Friday. But next comp up we have is Ashe Porcelain. This is my favorite of this patch so far. I've been defaulting this and also like hard forcing this comp just because I want to learn it a bit more, play it a bit more, but overall very solid. I like how this uses both AD and AP items. The one tricky part about this is that I found that you want to have a ton of items with this build. So if you get an encounter that gives a lot of items, that's when I favor this comp over the Kaisa comp. Because the Kaisa comp, you really just focus on Kaisa plus one main tank. Xayah items, you just pick up leftovers later on. But the Ashe Porcelain build, I guess it's not even a Porcelain build, it's more so an Ashe Invoker build. You want to itemize Lillia, Ashe, and then maybe 2 tanks, Annie, Ornn, or Nautilus, depending on who's 2-star. And then if you have even more extras, you have Azir and Lissandra to put items on. So there's just a lot more stuff to do here. So I like this comp a lot more when I have more item resources. Because you play 5 different 4-cost units, you want to be fast aiding for this in most cases. Sometimes you skip to level 9 if you could afford to. It's honestly a pretty decent level 9 board as well. For your tank items, put them on whoever you have 2-star. You don't have to put them on like only Ornn or only Annie. If you have a 2-star Nautilus and a 1-star Annie, 1-star Ornn, put the items on Nautilus. And then put generic items on the backline. For Ashe, I'd say the only necessary item is the Rage Blade. And then Lillia, I found that anything goes. I like having Morello the most. I think the mana item on her is optional if you have 4 Invoker in. And then just putting any AP items on her will do there. Pretty much a ton of augments work for this build too. I've seen so many different things work, but any combat, any item augment will do. If it's stage 2, any econ augment's good for this to get to level 8 more consistently. And both Lillia and Ashe perform really, really well without many synergies. So before you reach like level 9, which is how many units you see here, you could just play like 3 Invoker, and I found that the power level doesn't really change that much. You just drop the Azir, or you could also drop Udyr, lose the Behemoth, and play 4 Invoker. If you don't have Azir yet, you could use like Alune or literally anyone. It's not the end of the world. But yeah, pretty much only mandatory item is the Rage Blade on Ashe. Apart from that, like it's pretty flexible. Any tank items work, pretty much any Lillia item works. Lissandra can use a bunch of stuff too, same with Azir. Very, very solid comp that I like to play a lot right now. Next up we have is the A tier Umbral Alune. This one's gonna be a bit of a different comp. 6 Umbral is actually really powerful right now. If we look at the last patch, let's head on over to stats and then traits. Type in Umbral over here. We can see that, well, obviously 9 Umbral is disgusting good, right? But 6 Umbral, 4.09, 4 Umbral, 5.09. 4 Umbral is good to get into 6 Umbral because it's really hard to get set, so there's going to be some bias with this data. Either you get set and get to 6 Umbral, or you don't, or you have an Umbral Spatula. I'm going to be honest, the Umbral Spatula, I don't think they're that important. I mean, it's definitely useful, but it's not completely bonkers like it is in other builds. Like other builds, you get an extra spatula, you're like, wow, this comp got like 10 times better. With the Umbral Spatula, you're like, yeah, it's nice, but it's not like anything too crazy, I found at least. But it is good because you get to drop Darius, or you don't have to look for set, so obviously you still want it. But you want to be following a 3-cost reroll leveling pattern for this comp because Alune's very important, and one important thing is Alune is the priority, not Yone. Another thing to note is that you don't really need Invoker. 2 Invoker doesn't do too much. That's why you see a lot of people building Spirit Shojin on Alune, because Umbral is more important than Invoker. If you've never played 3-cost reroll before, definitely check out the leveling guide that we made at the beginning of the set. We go over all the different leveling patterns, including standard leveling, all the rerolls, and a bunch of other stuff as well. But overall, this is going to be a decent reroll comp, probably one of the best ones right now. Next up we have is Syndra Faded. Because a lot of 4 costs are being taken out of the pool, you can get Syndra for free pretty often. A lot of people are even defaulting Syndra. I think that's a little extreme, but everyone has their own taste and flavors. It's good if you have a low budget game because you don't really need too many items. You just need 3 items on Syndra. And honestly, Yasuo as a tank in the mid to late game works out pretty well if you don't get the better faded tanks. Obviously, you still want to replace Yasuo eventually, but this build is pretty decent. You run 4 Arcanists as well. It's great because Ahri's an Arcanist with the Syndra, so they're both faded. It's just a very good natural combo. So getting a +1 faded is super important in this build. I feel like this emblem has a lot more power because you get all the faded bonuses on your extra unit multiplied by 300% at 7 faded. So getting that on Ornn is make or break in a lot of cases. In the late game, I like linking up my Set and my Syndra, but it depends on what augments you have. If you have something like Ascension, you might want like double tank augments or double sustain augments, so you might pair up Set plus a Thresh. You might even pair up your Ornn if you have the emblem, getting the % heal. I've seen some pro players use that, sometimes they don't, but it really depends on what augments you have. If you have like all defensive augments, like you have Unified Resistance, you have a bunch of like shielding augments or whatever, then maybe you want to go double damage. Maybe go like Syndra and Ahri pair, for example, or Syndra Set, because that one's a pretty good default one. That's the one I use in like 80% of my games in the late game, because the healing on Set is still insane, and Syndra just gives a lot of damage, which is really good in the late game. For items, blue buff is mandatory on Syndra. I would not play this without a blue buff. Spear of Shojin, I guess you could get away with it, but you really probably should be playing a different comp if you're doing that, unless you get this comp completely for free, and then you could fast 9, play more legendary units, and call it a day after that. But just standard level into Syndra, level 8, roll down. You could stabilize on level 6 or level 7 with this comp. That's one bonus of this, because you have a bunch of 3-cost units and you have a bunch of 2- and 1-cost units if you stabilize on level 6. So there are a lot of different decision points for this type of build. Oh, by the way, for augments, one really good one's going to be Little Buddies, because you run a lot of crappers. You have like Ahri, you could even run Yasuo, Kindred. I think I'm missing a different option that you could also play too, maybe like someone that's Exalted. And then it buffs up your Syndra, Ornn, and Set a bunch, which is pretty cool. Pretty much any vertical comp makes great use of Little Buddies because they run a lot of 1- and 2-cost units, and it just gets a lot more value out of running those crappers. Next up we have is Ethereal Blade Shen. This is pretty much an item check. You want like Rage Blade, as many Rage Blades as you can. And you also want to be following a 2-cost reroll pattern. That means rolling down at level 6, econing back up, and rolling down to 50 every single turn. 6 Behemoth is going to be the core, and after that, like once you hit Shen 3, you just level up, play other random units in the game. Next build up we have is Shenna comp. This one's going to be Senna and Shen with a bunch of Ghostly, 6 Ghostly in this case, and this comp should be getting fixed. The B patch came out a couple hours before we made this, but it didn't really change the meta too much apart from this little Ghostly change, and since Ghostly essentially did not apply to Senna before and now it does, her stats are going to be completely different and should be a powerful force in this current patch. Pretty much any combat augment's going to work great for this comp. I really like getting support items as well. Getting support items for your Ghostly units, let them live a little longer so that they get the Ghostly procs guaranteed. Something like a Locket of the Iron Solari, I love that item a ton whenever I play 6 Ghostly. But even something as simple as like Randuin's or Aegis both work well to get your units to always trigger. Items on Senna, I like having a Last Whisper. After that, I don't really care too much. Maybe an IE Rage Blade's gonna be the best ones, but I'm not gonna break my back to try to get them. I found that Senna works with almost any item as long as you have some sort of armor penetration. If you're feeling a little risky, you could put the Last Whisper on a different unit or play a Even Shroud on maybe like Aatrox or Alawi. That way you get armor pen from a different source and you could do full damage items on Senna instead. Next build up we have is Lee Sin Kayn. Typical 4-cost Heavenly comp, which is odd because Heavenly doesn't have any 4-cost, so you use different ones instead. They did change Heavenly a bit, that's why this comp dropped a bunch, but overall still a solid build, especially since no one's really playing Lee Sin. You get to hit it for free. A bunch of people are playing Kayn, but not to the extent that people are playing stuff like Kaisa, Ashe, Lillia, things like that, or any of the 4-cost tanks. So this build is pretty easy to hit uncontested because everything else is like double contested, so that's one of the advantages of going for this build. Next up we have is Lux Reroll. 2-cost reroll here. Lots of different things you could do on Lux. Utility build, damage build. We have the damage build here right now. If you want to check out the utility build, you just switch the items out. I think Shojin is pretty much mandatory if you do not have Boiling Point, but you could do something like a Morellonomicon. you could do something like a Static Shiv, and she's going to do well with these two items, mainly because of the way Porcelain works. So Porcelain gives attack speed after you cast, so you get a bunch of free Static Shiv procs. Morello's obviously really good because she hits so many units in a line, and also reduces healing so they don't heal back up as she's kind of whittling down the whole team. So overall, pretty solid build here, and you have a bunch of different choices. By the way, if you have a Static Shiv on Lux, you do not need Ionic Spark on Amumu. You only need one source of magic penetration, and no matter where you get it, does not matter. You could also go for Alawi 3-star. Alawi 3-star is pretty solid. Zoe 3-star is a good secondary carry if you have a lot of extra items in your game from encounters and whatnot, but mainly just focus on the Ashe and the Amumu. Then get as many Arcanist and Porcelain in there as possible. All the +1 augments are here listed out. Super duper powerful, and then of course Boiling Point gonna be great. Next comp up we have is the Aphelios Reroll. If you have a bunch of Aphelii in the early game, go for this comp and a bunch of Threshes. I like playing this comp with Ascension a ton. I feel like Aphelios makes it to the later parts of the fight very easily because Thresh is such a beast of a tank. And then of course your Rage Blade's ticking the whole time and Aphelios just auto fires, kills everyone hopefully, and you win the rounds that way. Overall, pretty solid comp, pretty uncontested right now, but you have to be a little careful. It depends how many other reroll players there are for 3-cost units, because the more there are, the easier it is to hit your comp. So when you do go for this, make sure that there's at least an Alune reroll player, for example, or some other 3-cost unit. Next comp up we have is Heavenly Yone. If you have a ton of Yones, you could go for this build. It got nerfed a lot recently, like they changed Heavenly, they changed Titan's Resolve, so it is a bit weaker than it was before, but there's still a time and place for this. If you get a bunch of Yones, you could still do the same build and do pretty decently. Next build up we have is Janna Zyra Reroll. I would only use this if you have 2 healthy or Enter the Dragon, in which case this comp is like borderline S tier. If not, probably like low A tier, so it's in the middle of A tier right now, but just think if you have the good augments, it's probably S-. If you have none of them, probably like A-, maybe even B+. Unless you start the game with like a billion Jannas and you hit it for free. But Janna shields everything, she casts a bunch and does a bunch of damage, and then Dragon Lord, 4 Dragon Lord is so broken, so bonkers. So whenever you have a chance to play it, definitely go for it. 5 Dragon Lord, even crazier. So that's a great thing about this build. You always want like stacking items on Janna or things to make her cast faster. So like Shojin really good, Rageblade decent, Archangel's decent. Nashers I've seen do well, even Static Shiv I've seen do well too, but I like putting Static Shiv on one of my other units such as the Zyra, and then Diana is going to be your main tank. Next build up we have is Inkshadow Kaisa. Only go for this comp if you have +1 Inkshadow and if the Inkshadow items that you get are actually good. I recommend data checking for that, so go on over to stats, then items, click this thing on the right hand side, go to Inkshadow items, and then you see like Toxin, Force, Bombardment, all really good. Obviously some of these you want Udyr for, so just keep that in mind, but pretty much all of them are playable. It just depends what units you have and who you're carrying. Like Force obviously is really good on Udyr. If you don't have Udyr, it's not going to be that useful, right? But Toxin, Bombardment, Fury, all usable on Kaisa, so you don't need to worry too much about it until you hit like the later parts of Inkshadow. But obviously getting more of these bonkers items the better. Also, fun tip of the day, the best spatula holder for Inkshadow is pretty much anyone useless, so just throw it on someone who like you're not going to itemize that much. Sadly in this case it's going to be Xayah, because you want the 3 tank items on Ornn because all the other tanks here kind of suck. Next one up we have is Arcanist Warden. Solid Syndra build. I think the faded version's a bit better, so I would aim for that instead of this version. Next one up we have is Lillia Invoker. The other Lillia comp with Ashe, probably a bit better, but if you're heavy on Invoker, or you get like +1 Invoker or +1 Mythic, definitely go for this. Get a bunch of damage items on Lillia. Hui's great in the late game. And then Sylas and Annie are always going to be solid tanks, no question about that. So if you get this comp for free, it's pretty good. Or you could play it with like +1 Mythic, +1 Invoker. Next one up we have is Storyweaver Bard. If you have a bunch of Rage Blades, if it's like the Anvil Buffet or Component Buffet portal, or you have Pandora's Items, this one's really good. Or if you have a bunch of Rage Blades, so you don't even have to decide on that. Bard is definitely one of the outs you could kind of consider. Not the strongest comp in the game right now, but it's a good like back pocket option if you're kind of cheesing the Rage Blade. So a lot of people build Rage Blade for Ashe right now. Senna also works, Bard works, the Shen Ethereal Blades comp also uses this. So if you're playing those and you get a ton of Bards, you could always switch into this because you really just need tank items plus 2 Rage Blades. There's really not too much else for this comp. You're not worried about having a perfect item for your third unit you're going to itemize. So as long as you have the Rage Blades and some tank items, like Tahm Kench can kind of use anything too. Next build up we have is Built Different. Honestly, it's a bit tricky to play right now. I think it's actually a good augment. It did get nerfed a little bit, but the reason why it's hard to play is because a lot of people are buying all the 4-cost units, so it makes it harder for you to hit whatever you want to hit. All the tanks are really good. Annie, Ornn, Sylas, Nautilus. The units in the back line are going to be Kaisa, Ashe, and Syndra, but like all 3 of them are hotly contested, so this augment should theoretically be pretty good, but it's getting like a little bit cucked because of all the other comps that are stealing your units, especially the front line. I find it so hard to upgrade the front line right now in Built Different. I think I played 1 game on it on the new patch, and like, man, everyone's playing Ornn, everyone's playing Annie, and then like everyone's playing Sylas/Galio, so it's a tough life out there for Built Different people. KogMaw Reroll, if you get too much candy, that's when I would go for this the most. Other than that, it did get buffed a tiny bit. If we type in KogMaw here, you can see the 3-star average placement on the previous patch is 4.56. So what that means is you pretty much only want to play this when you get too much candy. So that's going to be the best augment for this. But if you start the game with like a ton of KogMaws and you have like Nashor's blue buff pretty much already built, then sure, go for this. But apart from that, there probably are better things to go for, but definitely a good back pocket option. A lot of the lower comps in the A tier are always like back pocket options. Like there are times to go for them and you could definitely win games or like at least top 4 with them a lot of times. But you need to know when to go for them, and that's kind of the tricky part about TFT. Zoe, Soraka, Diana reroll. They did buff Zoe recently. This is going to be another version of the Janna Zyra build, except this time instead of focusing on Janna, you focus on Zoe. It depends what units you're hitting. What I like about this comp over the other one is that it's not as much of an augment check, but if you do get too healthy, this comp is really, really good, and if you don't get too many Jannas, you could switch into this Zoe build you see here. Alune Invoker reroll. The Umbral one's a lot better, so probably don't want to play this one if you can help it, but let's say you're going for Alune reroll. You see an early Azir and you have like a pair of Lillias on your bench because you just bought them during the roll down, then yeah, you could definitely consider this comp going to be very solid. And sometimes you're dealt a bunch of invokers, so you got to invoke them, you know? You can't just Umbral them all day. Focus main tank items on Annie, but you definitely want to be playing at least 2 Umbrals so you get the execute on Alune. You could also do Morello builds, but this damage build you see here also works. Next build up we have is Duelist Reroll. Duelist got buffed, and for all the nerds that remember from before, when we looked at the augments, Duelist did really, really well. So we type in Duelist here, Duelist Crest, Duelist Crown. I guess the Crest is the one that did well, but Crown, I don't think they got the buff of getting 2 units instead of 1 unit. It's still pretty decent, I'd say. I think the reason why the 2-1 average placement is a bit lower, 4.57, is because people are just taking this so they could force a comp, not necessarily taking it because they have a ton of duelists. But obviously if you have a ton of duelists, this is going to be pretty good in the early game. But overall average placements, 4.12, 4.3. Obviously that's very nice. Anything better than 4.4 is going to be solid. Anything better than 4.5 is going to be solid. There's like the average up here in case you want to compare it, because a lot of other stat websites do not have this feature. They just show you a bunch of numbers and then you're like, oh, cool. But if we, for example, go to all the item stats, you'll notice that a lot of items perform better than average. Like the worst one we have is like 5.01, and like up until item 1, like 25 or something, everything's above a 4.5. So that's a little funky, right? Because the average is actually 4.33. So kind of a little cool thing there about this website compared to other ones. The reason why the data works like this is because people who win games tend to have a lot more items, so it kind of skews the numbers a little bit. But that's just one thing to kind of keep in mind whenever you're looking at this stuff. But the 8 duelist version with the +1 duelist can be very powerful. Put it on Diana or Wukong. It's normally Diana just because you run her because you want Dragon Lord. And she's also a 3-cost unit that you can kind of 3-star. But Volibear, Tristana going to be the main people. And then Lee Sin, decent secondary carry. And if you hit Aurelia, she's going to be very powerful even without perfect items. Next build up we have is Kobuko Lucky Claws. Only go for this if you have at least 3 Kobukos before you play the augment. Play some Bruisers, win the early game, actually destroy the early game. Get some random Kaisa items, does not matter what they are. And for Kobuko, throw as many tank items on him as possible. B tier is Dryad, Ghostly, Kha'Zix Reroll, Mythic Bard. Like, you don't really need these comps that much in your repertoire, but there's a time and place for them. It just isn't that off. But let's go back up to the top. There's this little handy button down here that you can click on the website to go up there. But I'm going to be defaulting AD this patch, Kaisa and Ashe. And if I have a lot of ability power items in the beginning, Syndra is going to be my force, followed by Alune reroll if I have a bunch of Alunes. And then if I end up high rolling in any of these comps, I'm going to try to go for Fast 9. I don't know if you noticed the pattern, but in both Kaisa Bruiser and the Ashe comp, you're playing a ton of legendaries anyway, so just getting to level 9 super duper duper important. Even if you're playing a bunch of 4 costs, level 9 helps those odds out tremendously too. So sometimes people are just fast 9ing even though they're playing like the Ashe comp, for example. But let me know your thoughts on this meta down in the comments below or in the Discord channel. Link is in the description as well. We will be updating this next Friday as we do every single Friday, but so far things are looking pretty similar to what they were like last patch. The only difference I can think of is maybe like Kayn Lee Sin's a little bit worse because they changed Heavenly, but you pretty much just go for the Ashe or Kaisa build in most games. Those are what I've been seeing that are going to be like destroying most comps right now, but obviously like legendaries are still good. There's some dark horses if you get very specific augments. Like I've seen Ethereal Blade Shen completely destroy stuff. Hopefully the Shenna comp is back because Ghostly's getting fixed. And then of course Syndra is like the backup 4-cost unit, or if you get AP items. But there's honestly a lot of stuff you can play. But that's going to be it for me from this video. Again, check the website bunnymuffins.lol/meta for more information, and good luck on not getting contested.